In 1995, I was beginning my graduate study at Princeton, and like many graduate students, starting to ponder what I was going to write my dissertation on. And that same year, 1995, was the year that the United Nations decided to declare the Year of Tolerance. Now, the bureaucracy of the United Nations moves slowly enough that lets you know tolerance had been on the map for several years before that, right? So in the late 1980s and the early 1990s, there's increasing discussion about the importance of tolerance and toleration. Now, this started to get me interested because I was already interested in John Locke. When I'd been at Cambridge, my master's thesis had been on John Locke. And one of John Locke's three most famous works is called The Letter Concerning Toleration, which is arguably the most famous work on toleration in the history of Western philosophy, right? So as I started thinking about it, it became something that I became personally interested in as well, for a couple of reasons. So I'm an evangelical Christian, and as a result, there are certain things that I believe. For example, I believe that people shouldn't commit idolatry. Right? But I also believe that we shouldn't throw people in jail because they committed idolatry, right? So in other words, even though I think idolatry is wrong, I don't think it's proper to use the coercive power of the state to force people to think the way I do. And as I started thinking about this question, I started realizing that there's really a difficult and complex issue here, right? There are things we think are wrong. There are things that we disapprove of. But it's not obvious how we decide which of the things we disapprove of are things that it is appropriate to use the power of the state to try to put a stop to. And so I started getting interested in the question of how we sort out which things should be tolerated and which things should not be tolerated. I think another reason that I was interested in the question of toleration, though, is because of a certain perception that exists of evangelicals, right? Which is that we are an intolerant bunch, right? So that was certainly already the perception in the mid-90s and late 90s as I was in graduate school, and if anything, it's only increased since then. So here's a public opinion poll that I came across that I think sheds a lot of light on this dynamic, and it brings together the intersection of my interest in politics, in religion, and the subject of toleration. So in the year 2014, the Pew Foundation took a survey where they asked parents about what the most important virtues were to teach to children. And they gave them a long list of virtues, 12 in all, right? So it included things like obedience, empathy, curiosity, creativity, responsibility, hard work, persistence, being well-mannered, helping others, religious faith, and tolerance, right? So out of this group of 12 virtues, all of them I think kind of highly desirable things, they asked the following difficult question. Of these, which do you think are the three most important to teach children? They also asked them, beyond those three that you think are most important, are there others that you would still describe as especially important? And what you can see on the graph is the way that the answers to that question varied a lot by people's political persuasion, right? So on the left, right, you see how people answered who describe themselves politically as consistently liberal, and on the far right, how people answered who describe themselves as consistently conservative. The differences in how they responded are very interesting, right? So among those who described themselves as consistently liberal, 11% thought religious faith was one of the most important things to pass on to children. Whereas for conservatives, the number was more than 5 times as high. Nearly 60% included religious faith as among the most important things to pass along. If we include not just the people who said most important, but also the people who said that it was especially important, the gap narrows a little bit, but not very much, right? So for those who are consistently liberal, 26% thought it was important. For those who are consistently conservative, a full 81% thought it was important, right? So more than 3 times as many, again, giving that response. Now, on the other hand, if we ask how people responded on the subject of tolerance, we get a very different view, right? So among those who are consistently conservative, only 3% thought tolerance was among the most important virtues, whereas for liberals who were consistently liberal, the number was 7 times as high, 22%. Now, if we, again, expand it to include both that answer and also the people who said it was especially important, nearly 90% of those who were consistently liberal thought tolerance was especially important. But interestingly, 41% of conservatives said the same thing. So again, it's a very large gap, but it's also striking that even among those who describe themselves as consistently conservative, a full 40% thought tolerance was an especially important virtue to teach children. Now, why is it politically we see this gap, right, in terms of how people value religious faith on the one hand and tolerance on the other? Well, a significant part of it, I think, is the demographics of our electorate. It just so happens that in our country, people who describe themselves as consistently conservative are more likely to be evangelical or some other variations of Christian. And so there's a correlation between evangelicalism and political conservatism. Similarly, there's a correlation between being consistently liberal and being more secular. Now, of course, these are generalizations. You can obviously find people who are very devout in their faith who are consistently liberal. You can find atheists who are consistently conservative. But as a trend, this is something that's been widely noted for a long time. I think part of the reason this dynamic exists is just some of the quirks of the way America's political system has kind of nudged people into different political parties. But I think there's a deeper issue which is important to talk about as well. Because I think for many people, evangelicals who make universalistic truth claims are by definition intolerant. In other words, whether you're Republican or Democrat, to claim that you're right and everyone else is wrong, by definition seems to be a mark of intolerance. So one of the big questions this raises is this: do universal truth claims lead to intolerance? If someone says that only through Jesus can a person be saved, does taking that position by definition mean that that person is intolerant? Well, one of the things I'm going to do in my talk today is to try to suggest that that's not the right way of thinking about the question. And my main reason for that has to do with my concern for justice in a world that is broken. The title of the talk, remember, is about toleration and justice in a broken world. And it's a little bit of a contrast for those of you who were here for last week's talk on mercy. We were focusing particularly on America, and we talked about some of the injustices that exist in America's prison system with our very high rates of incarceration. So last week the focus was on America, but today I want the focus to be broader and to be on the world. Because the reality is there are enormous injustices that are not local problems, they're global problems. One of those is the problem of massive global poverty. So according to the World Bank in 2015, there are 700 million people in the world today who live on less than $1.90 per day. That's the World Bank's definition of extreme poverty. Now, obviously, you can define poverty much more broadly than that and get much larger numbers, right? But those who are in extreme poverty, right? These are people who face tremendous challenges just getting the basic food and nutrition and shelter and so forth that they need to be able to survive. 700 million people in our world find themselves in that situation. We also have enormous problems with human trafficking and slavery. According to a UN estimate in 2012, there are about 21 million people who are victims of human trafficking and slavery in our world today. So this would include people who have been lured into the sex trade against their will and without their consent, or as minors who haven't reached the age of adulthood and aren't able to give their consent. It would include people who are in debt slavery. I mean, there's a whole variety of different forms of this. But the reality is it is a massive problem and it is a global problem. There's also the problem of racial discrimination, right? In the United States, the topic of racial discrimination has obviously been much more in the news and the media over the last couple of years. But I think it's a huge mistake to see this as uniquely an American problem. Each nation has its own history that affects the details of what it looks like, but the reality is discrimination on the basis of race, ethnicity, tribal membership is something that is happening around the world. Europe is wrestling with racial questions related to immigration in a very serious way right now. It's a huge issue in the developing world as well. Many of us thought that when South Sudan became independent from the northern part of Sudan, it would end the fighting between Christians and Muslims and there would be peace. But instead, what we've seen in South Sudan is now different tribal groups within South Sudan in conflict with each other. Right? These are all global problems. And all of them, I think, raise issues of justice, and they're issues that need to be addressed. But notice when I start making claims that these are global problems, and global problems that are a matter of justice, we're starting to make universal truth claims, right? We're saying that human trafficking is wrong everywhere, not that just that it's merely wrong around here. And it's precisely because I think our commitment to justice compels us to take seriously the possibility of universal truth claims about issues of justice and morality that I think the topic of toleration becomes so important. So here are my goals tonight. First, I want to clarify what toleration is and its relationship to justice. And then secondly, I want to show that Christianity suggests ways of better understanding the relationship between justice and toleration. So let me start off with a definition. What does it mean to be tolerant? Well, here's the definition I want to use tonight. A person is tolerant when he or she rightly decides not to stop someone from doing something of which the tolerant person disapproves. Now, that's a little bit of a mouthful, so let me kind of go through it in parts to explain what I mean. First, I want to draw your attention to that last word, the word disapproves. I think one of the mistakes that is frequently made in popular discussions about tolerance or toleration is that we use toleration and acceptance as interchangeable terms. In other words, you think the more accepting I am, the more tolerant I am. The more things I celebrate, the more tolerant I am. But historically, toleration was something that would arise when there was something that you disapproved of. If you approve of something, you don't need to tolerate it, right? The question of toleration doesn't arise. Now, that's not to say, and we'll come back to this, that the question of what I should approve of and disapprove of is an unimportant question. It's a very important question. But I think tolerance raises a uniquely distinct issue, which is, given the fact that I do disapprove of some things, how do I then decide what to do about the things that I disapprove of? Now, some people may find this, disappointing. Maybe we'd rather live in a world where no one disapproves of anything. Maybe that's the reason on Facebook there's no dislike button, right? We want a world where everybody just likes everything. But the reality is, even on Facebook and certainly other social media, it does not take you long to find lots of disapproval of lots of things being voiced. Because the reality is, the human condition is such that we will always approve of and disapprove of things. And we're not all going to agree about what we approve of and what we disapprove of, right? So that's going to create conditions under which the virtue of toleration becomes important. The second thing I want to say is a little bit about the word stop. What do I mean by stop? What does it mean to stop someone from doing something? Well, what I mean by that is, are you using coercion to prevent people from acting according to what they think they ought to do? What I mean to do is distinguish coercion from persuasion. So in other words, if I persuade you to adopt a different course of action, I haven't stopped you because you're still being able to do what you want. You've just been persuaded to take on a different path. On the other hand, if I sort of either don't attempt to persuade you or I get frustrated because I'm failing to persuade you, and so I instead try to force you to do what I want, now I'm engaging in coercive behavior. Again, I think this is an extremely important part of the virtue of toleration because we need to preserve the ability to talk with people we disagree with. Because we disagree about what we approve of and disapprove of, it's important that we be able to have conversations about that, and meaningful conversations will mean trying to persuade one another to adopt a different course. But I think it should also mean having a healthy respect for the right of other people to be moral agents who at the end of the day are allowed to make decisions for themselves. And then lastly, I want to call your attention to the word rightly. Now, this is actually a little different than the way I define toleration in the book, but it will simplify my terminology for the rest of the evening if we do it this way. In normal, everyday speech, when people aren't being philosophers, they typically use the phrase tolerant as a compliment, right? And if you call someone intolerant, you're criticizing them, right? So in other words, if you think just about the way we use the word toleration in everyday speech, normally to call someone tolerant is to commend them, and to call them intolerant is to say they should have acted differently in some way. So I'm just going to adopt that convention for this evening because it'll simplify the discussion a little bit. But nothing of substance actually hangs on this. I could do the whole rest of the talk talking about appropriate toleration or justified toleration as a way of describing what I'm talking about. Okay, so let me give an example to illustrate how the definition works. So here's a hypothetical evangelical. She believes that only through faith in Jesus Christ can a person be saved. She also tries to persuade other people to become Christians, right? This is called evangelism, right? She's trying to persuade people to become Christians. But she also believes that each person should have the freedom to decide for herself what religion she should pursue. So is she tolerant? Well, let's work through the different parts of the definition, right? She disapproves of other religions. In other words, by believing that only through Jesus can people be saved, she's implicitly disagreeing with religions that claim otherwise, or atheists who deny that anyone can be saved at all, right? So because there's disagreement, right, there's disapproval, there's an occasion where toleration is possible. Secondly, I hope this will be uncontroversial, she's right to respect freedom of conscience. In other words, people should be able to choose which religion they're going to worship, or if they choose to worship no religion at all. And so respecting freedom of conscience is compatible with justice, right? The conclusion she's coming to is the right conclusion. We should commend her for this. And then third, she may try to persuade people to want something different, but she's not stopping people from doing what they want. Right? So it fits the different definitions. Now, some people at this point may be dissatisfied, right? Because it still seems like there's something intolerant about her position. But what I want to suggest is the question, is she tolerant, may not be the most important question here. Instead, the most important question may be, is she right? Because there are times when toleration is a second best virtue. In other words, suppose I disapprove of something and I shouldn't disapprove of it. Well, in that case, it's good that I'm tolerating, right? That's better than the alternative of being intolerant. But maybe it would be even better if I didn't disapprove of that thing in the first place, right? So we can acknowledge that just because we've said someone's tolerant, we haven't said everything there is to say about our moral assessment of that person. Now, the reason I think this is the more helpful question is because it really focuses our attention on the central issue. Because the central issue is really this: is the truth claim she's making right? When she says that only through Jesus can people be saved, maybe what she's saying is true, but maybe what she's saying is false. And if what she's saying is false, then the whole rest of the argument is deficient, right? Because she's approving of something she shouldn't and disapproving of other things that she shouldn't disapprove of. But notice that when we frame the question this way, truth claims are being advanced both by her and by the people who criticize her, right? Because if you say there are other ways other than through Jesus Christ that people may be saved, you're making a truth claim as well, right, about how one can or can't be saved. Or if you say, well, actually, there is no heaven, no one can be saved, once again, you're making a truth claim, right? But now we're all talking about the right thing, and we can have a discussion about whether her substantive position is or isn't right. Oftentimes, that question gets, I think, unhelpfully confused with the question of whether she is tolerant or not. So now let me talk a little bit about the relationship between toleration and justice. The first thing I want to say is that toleration needs justice. Toleration needs justice because we shouldn't tolerate everything. When we start thinking about the problems of global poverty or racial discrimination or human trafficking, those aren't things we should choose to just tolerate. Those are things we should work to try to actively prevent, eliminate, or reduce. And justice helps give us clues about where we should turn our attention to problems that need to be eliminated as we try to work against those injustices. We can't tolerate everything, and so a theory of justice helps us know what we should tolerate and what we should not tolerate. But secondly, I also want to argue that toleration helps justice, because justice with toleration is better than the alternative of relativism. Relativism, at first glance, seems like a helpful way of justifying the virtue of tolerance or toleration. When I teach classes, I frequently hear students voice variations on this position. And here's the logic, right? The logic says, if I acknowledge that no one person's moral beliefs are any more true than anyone else's moral beliefs, it would be irrational for me to then try to impose my moral beliefs on someone else. Or if you take that same argument and instead of applying it at the individual level, you apply it at the cultural level. You might say, if there's no way to say that the moral beliefs of one culture are any more true than the cultural beliefs of another culture, it's irrational for one culture to impose its culture on another society, right? That's the normal logic of how the argument goes. The problem is, I think the argument doesn't actually work. Because the problem is, sometimes the viewpoint that either an individual holds or a culture holds contains the view that it should impose its views on other people, right? So in other words, if you had been talking with Americans who believed in manifest destiny, right, in the 1800s in America, their cultural belief was that it was right for them to expand as far westward as they could. If that meant destroying Native American culture along the way, they thought they were entitled to do so. In other words, the cultural belief that many Americans had at the time, if we respect those cultural beliefs, the result is them acting in ways that are detrimental to other cultures, right? It may be that when we get into a discussion with Genghis Khan, as he articulates his worldview, he's acting perfectly consistent with his worldview as he goes on military rampages, right? So we need some standard outside of the individual or the culture to be able to say, this is wrong, this is unjust, right? So although relativism is tempting, I don't think it's a helpful solution to the problem. But I think one of the reasons relativism is attractive to many people is that they've frequently seen people pursue justice without acknowledging the importance of toleration. In other words, if the only question for someone is, what do I think is right? And the next step is impose my views on as many people as possible, it's not surprising that many people start looking for some other alternative framework. But I think it's possible to have a commitment to justice that isn't relativistic, that's combined with a commitment to toleration. So now let me say a little bit about my approach to toleration. So the scholar that I've spent the most time studying over the course of my career is a philosopher named John Locke, one of the most famous philosophers in the history of philosophy. And as I mentioned, one of his most famous works is called A Letter Concerning Toleration. Now, part of what's interesting to me about Locke and his writings on toleration is that he makes a Christian case for toleration. So in other words, in the opening pages of his letter, the basic argument he makes is this. In his day, there were many countries that were using the power of the state to force people to adhere to a particular religion, right? So if you lived in France, you would face persecution if you weren't Catholic. If you lived in England, you would face persecution if you were Catholic, right? And Locke is trying to speak to both groups and to suggest that a policy of religious toleration would be better. And the first argument he uses in the letter concerning toleration is a Christian argument. He says, if you look in the Bible and you look at the example of Jesus, Jesus had enormous power, had enormous authority, but he didn't go around forcing people to believe in him. He loved people, he performed miracles, right? He did a variety of things to try to persuade people to follow him. But although he had enormous power, he didn't try to force people to follow him, right? So if we're going to follow the example of Jesus, toleration is something that should be commended, even if we believe people are making terrible mistakes that may have eternal consequences for them. But in addition to that, Locke also made a case for toleration that was based on universal justice. One of the things Locke is famous for in another of his famous works, the Two Treatises of Government, is the claim that all human beings everywhere have certain rights. These include things like life and liberty. He was making a universalistic claim. He's saying in all cultures everywhere, there is a basic right to things like life and liberty, which makes it easy for someone like John Locke to look at the problem of human trafficking, right, and to come to the conclusion that injustices are taking place all around the world, right, because there's this universal standard, which we would probably today call human rights. Locke preferred the term natural rights, but human rights is the most common contemporary way we get at a similar idea. So what Locke was trying to do was to come up with an argument in favor of toleration that respects justice, but he also wanted to present an argument that would be persuasive even to people who didn't necessarily share his beliefs. I mean, he's also concerned about the persecution of Christians in Muslim countries as well, right? So he's trying to come up with an argument that he thinks has applicability and could potentially be persuasive to people even if they're not Christians. And so that's the part of his argument that I want to focus on tonight. So here's what I would call a Christian account from John Locke. I should say that this is by no means the only Christian way of thinking about toleration. In fact, in some ways, it's kind of unique to Locke, which is why I can get mileage writing books and publishing articles about it. And I'll also say, and we can go into this more in the question and answer period, there are complexities of figuring out exactly what was going on in John Locke's heart on the subject of religion. What I can say is the way I'm going to be presenting the argument is the way Locke himself presents it in his writings on religious toleration, right? But only God knows the heart. We talked about that a little bit last week in the talk on mercy. So here are the basic steps of Locke's argument. He says, first, God communicates knowledge to us through reason that we should respect the rights of all people. In other words, that all people have rights to things like life and liberty, and we ought to respect those rights. Now, Locke believed that this was something we could know through reason. You didn't necessarily have to open your Bible to be persuaded of that fact. And in doing so, I think he's drawing upon a part of the Christian tradition which says that God has more than one way of communicating with people, right? And there's some degree of moral knowledge that all human beings have because they were created by God. Secondly, though, Locke notes that human beings are biased and fallible in interpreting and applying God's commands. So in other words, while God may be infallible, the human beings who are trying to carry out his instructions are not. We get a command, but when we get the command, we first have to interpret it. We might interpret it wrong. And then we have to figure out how to actually apply it in the real world, and there's any number of ways we might make mistakes there. Well, the crucial observation of Locke, and this is what in the book I call the legislative point of view, is to say that if God is the legislator of the moral law, God would take into account the fallibility and bias of those who will interpret and apply the law, because that's what any good legislator would do, right? Admittedly, people's opinions of our legislators are fairly low right now, but in the grand scheme of things, there's a particular perspective that a legislator is supposed to have, right? A legislator realizes that he's enacting a general rule that other people are going to be interpreting and applying, right? So you have to take into account the limitations of those who are going to be interpreting and applying your rule when you're deciding which rule to pass. So here's the specific example Locke gave as he was in debate with one of his contemporaries. Locke said, look, you and I both agree that the Church of England is the true religion, the Anglican Church. You are saying that God has issued a command to all political rulers everywhere that they should use force to bring as many people to the true faith as they possibly can. Locke said, God is too smart to issue a command like that one, because God realizes the possibilities for misinterpretation and misapplication. So let's start with misinterpretation. If I tell you, use force to promote the true religion, in practice what you have to do is promote the religion you think is true, and you might be wrong, right? So again, Locke is looking not just locally, but globally, and he's imagining those who are rulers in Muslim countries using their power to promote Islam, and those who are in Catholic countries using their power to promote Catholicism. People in South America or in Africa, promoting various kinds of tribal religions and so forth. And he fails to see how, in aggregate, this is going to be very helpful for bringing more people to the true religion. In other words, because the possibility of error is so high on the part of political rulers, right? We don't have any particular reason to think being elected president makes you more knowledgeable about the things of God. Locke thinks it would be better to not use coercion and ask people to content themselves with persuasion as they're trying to persuade one another about what religion is the true one. There's a second problem related to fallibility, which is even if you neglect the first problem and set it to the side, even if you're correct about which religion is true, you could very well choose means of using the power of the state that actually make things worse rather than make things better, right? I mean, think about censorship, right? I mean, there's people who are publishing things that are slandering your religion, so you try to censor it. Often what censoring does is just give free advertising and publicity to the very thing you were trying to get rid of, and now more people end up reading it instead of fewer, right? So it's very easy for attempts that are well-intentioned to backfire, right? And so you need to think about the likelihood that people will make good judgments about how to achieve the goal as well. So the conclusion that Locke came to is this: you should only use force if you would have other fallible people interpret and act on the same principle. Now, one of the things I want to say is that the way Locke got here was as follows, right? He has an interpretation of Jesus as tolerant, right? And he wants to come up with a rational argument that is in harmony with that. But I think he also is using a more just theistic argument that involves a two-level way of thinking about morality, right? There's a God who legislates the moral law, and then there's people who try to interpret and carry out that law. Now, I want to suggest, and I don't have time to go into the details now, but I'd be happy to in the question and answer period, that I think it is possible for people to agree with that principle even if they reject Locke's theological premises, right? You would just have to support the necessary assumptions in a different way. Let me now give a potential application of this, right? So I'm going to give a couple of different principles that someone could propose, and we're going to use Locke's test to figure out how promising they are as a way of deciding whether or not we should use coercive force to put a stop to something. Here's the first one. Suppose someone says a nation may intervene unilaterally if it thinks that grave human rights abuses are taking place on a large scale. Should we accept that or should we not accept that? Well, what Locke would encourage us to do as we're deciding whether or not we agree with that principle is not just to think, how would I act on that principle? You know, I can come to the conclusion, yes, we should invade Syria, no, we shouldn't invade Syria. But that's not the right way of thinking about it, right? A better way of thinking about it would be, would I want the United States to interpret and apply this principle? Would I want Russia to interpret and apply this principle? Would I want China to interpret and apply this principle? Would I want France to interpret and apply this principle? And as we start asking some of those questions, maybe we include Iraq and Iran and some of the other countries that are more geographically close, now all of a sudden the situation gets much more troubling, right? Because we may worry about interpretations, right? What one person thinks is a grave human rights abuse may not be what somebody else thinks is a grave human rights abuse. And we may also have problems about fallibility. In other words, even if we're in agreement that there are human rights abuses taking place, we need to have confidence that people will make wise decisions about whether the proposed intervention would actually make things better, when it's obviously quite possible that the intervention could end up making things worse or not end up solving the problem. I think for that reason, if I had to choose, I would prefer a second version of the principle, which says that states should militarily intervene only if there are grave human rights abuses and multinational support for intervention. The requirement of multinational support, I think, decreases the chances of improper or poorly thought out interventions, right? One country might have self-interested reasons that bias its interpretation of the facts. If you take in the opinions of more countries, that's less likely to happen. And in a sense, that's what Locke's principle is designed to do, right? To force us to think about how other people would interpret and apply the same principle that we are interpreting and applying. And part of the appeal of it, I think, is it's a way of showing respect for other people as moral agents. They get to make moral decisions and engage in moral interpretation just the same way I do, right? There's a kind of reciprocity and respect that's involved. But it's done in a way that doesn't foreclose the possibility of intervention. And by the way, intervention doesn't necessarily have to be military, right? Intervention could be economic sanctions and other forms of pressure potentially, right? But we're thinking about it in a different format. So to give a practical example, you know, my book on toleration came out in 2002. And it was in 2003 that the United States invaded Iraq. And lots of people would ask me, what do you think? Should we invade Iraq? Should we not invade Iraq? And at the time, a lot of the details about whether they had weapons of mass destruction were very hard to figure out, right? You're relying a lot on what intelligence agencies and the government are reporting. But my reason for being opposed to the intervention was I didn't like the precedent that was being set, right? It was about preemptive war in that case. And part of my thinking was, I see why you might think, in some cases, a preemptive war would be better than waiting until later when the consequences could be worse. But I also worried quite a lot if I thought about, you know, say India or Pakistan using the same kind of rationale, or Israel and Iraq, or so forth, right? That all of these are very real issues where you worry about how bias and self-interest could cause the country unilaterally to say we must strike to defend ourselves and protect ourselves. But the chances of a wrong application seem very high to me when it's done unilaterally. All right, so that's an example of the way this argument works. And to link it back to the examples I gave at the beginning of the talk, I think one of the things that's promising about things like global poverty and human trafficking and racism is there is actually quite a bit of international consensus on these things, that they are real problems and real injustices. Lots of countries have signed treaties agreeing with those principles. Now, a lot remains to be done because there's still the problem of trying to figure out how to address those problems, right? How to act in ways that address the injustice without making it worse in the process, right? And a lot of wisdom is needed to know how to do that. That's part of the reason I think these are promising situations for pursuing justice. So let me conclude by talking a little bit about toleration, mercy, and Christianity, and try to tie together a little bit the two lectures I've given. I think that one of the things that is distinctive about Christianity is that it has something to contribute to how we think about both the virtue of mercy and the virtue of toleration. And if I were going to try to summarize what I think it has to contribute, it's this. We need a commitment both to the importance of justice and a recognition of human weakness, bias, and fallibility. Right? So one possibility is abandoning a commitment to universal justice out of a kind of relativism. I think Christianity counsels us away from that. But we also need a recognition of human limitations, what I would like to call epistemic humility, right? Of realizing that we don't have to be skeptical about the possibility of justice to recognize our own limitations, the limits to our own wisdom, and our own fallibility. I put two Bible verses at the very beginning of my book, even though the book as a whole is very much geared toward dialogue with a secular audience. One was from Matthew chapter 7, verse 12, where Jesus states the golden rule, right? Do unto others as you would have them do unto you, right? It's a universal claim about how people ought to act everywhere. But the other was from Proverbs chapter 3, verse 7, where it says, do not be wise in your own eyes. Counseling people not to be wise in their own eyes isn't telling them to be skeptics, but it is asking them to be humility, to be humble, and to exercise humility. And so I think the principle of toleration that I'm suggesting is a way of trying to do both of those things, right? Acting on principles you would want others to act on, while taking into account our own weaknesses and limitations, and recognizing the possibility of our own mistakes. Thank you.
So Alex, we do have our first text question that I would like to ask, and that is, From the perspective of a non-believer, if a Christian belief is that it is just for a person who knowingly rejects Christ as Savior to spend an eternity in torment, how can society accept that tolerance for non-believers or other faiths can extend from this belief? And also, wouldn't this be the same thing as calling it just for people who disagree with Christians to spend eternity in hell, thus invalidating tolerance?
Yeah, so that's a great question. So the question, if I understood it right, is how can you still call something tolerant if as part of its beliefs, it includes a belief in something like hell, right? Doesn't that, by definition, make it intolerant? Well, what I want to say is, obviously the question of whether or not hell exists is a really important question, right? Because if Christians believe that hell exists and they're wrong, there's a whole series of judgments they're going to make that are going to be incorrect and may cause them to spend a lot of effort trying to persuade people to avoid a danger that doesn't actually exist, right? So, imagine the person who keeps telling you to quit smoking because it's going to cause you cancer. What if it turned out smoking didn't cause cancer, right? They would have spent a lot of time trying to persuade you to avoid something that wasn't actually harmful, right? So it's an important question whether it's true or not. And so obviously if somebody asserts the contrary, right, that hell doesn't exist, they're making a truth claim as well, and there are a lot of implications that come from that position. Nonetheless, I still think it's helpful, just as a matter of clarity, to use the phrase tolerance or toleration differently, right? Because what I'm talking about is whether or not we're going to force other people to adhere to the set of beliefs that we adhere to, right? So if there's someone who believes in hell and is trying to persuade people to become Christians because they want to avoid that person going to hell, there's something very significant about the willingness of that person to say that at the end of the day, even though I think there are disastrous consequences to the choice you're making, I still respect the fact that you're the one who gets to make that choice, right? It's not my place to force a decision on you. So what I'd want to say is, even if you may strongly disagree with the truth claim that the person is making, there's still a real virtue that's being displayed, and I think toleration is the best word to use to describe that virtue.
I'm Thomas, by the way. I think it was really awesome, man. It was great.
Thanks.
Good stuff. I like it. My first time being here, actually. My question revolves around the, I guess, how one can experience toleration or experience mercy. And as a Christian, how can you create that atmosphere without, okay, because I'm a Christian, I'm going to bestow mercy upon you. You know what I mean?
Right, right. Yeah.
You know? So how can one perceive that and say, oh my goodness, well, this is a little different.
Yeah.
That person provides a different atmosphere than someone else, and they just happen to be a Christian.
Yeah.
You know, so how can you kind of elaborate on that?
Yeah. So if I understand the question, we can extol virtues of mercy and toleration, but there's the question of what does it look like when somebody actually starts enacting these in real life? And what does it feel like if you're the person receiving mercy or you're the person receiving toleration? Because I think you're right that people don't always say thank you, right? One of the things in the book about mercy that we talk about is how mercy has a kind of hierarchy inherent in it that many people don't like, right? That normally when there's an occasion for mercy, there's someone in a position of strength or authority or power and someone else who's in a position of vulnerability. And so many people don't want to be in a position of needing to receive mercy. In fact, I think one of the reasons we would give for the decline of mercy is that in an age like ours, people would much rather demand their rights than beg for mercy, right? Because it puts you in a very vulnerable position when you're having to do that. Similarly, if I don't think there's anything wrong with what I'm doing and someone comes up and says, I tolerate you, you're glad that they're not coercing you. I mean, that's something to be genuinely thankful for. But like I said, it's a kind of second best virtue, right? Because you would rather them approve of you rather than merely tolerate you, right? So admittedly, that's just going to be part of the dynamic. And that's why I think some people try to aspire to a world where we don't need mercy and we don't need toleration. But I think in the kind of world we have that is deeply broken, where we have the level of disagreement we do about so many topics, we're not in that world, and we're not going to be in that world for a long time, right? So there's still going to be an important role for mercy and toleration to have.
Okay. Our next question is, from the viewpoint of an atheist, would you consider the one true religion be based upon the tolerance of other religions? In that way, no one is right or wrong, but merely tolerable?
So I'm not completely sure if I understood the question, but I think I would say that a true religion should show respect for the consciences of other people and their right to make decisions about what to believe or not believe. And so I see that as being a part of the true religion. But I would also say that that doesn't mean all religions are interchangeable, right? Because remember, to call something tolerant isn't to have the last word on whether it's true or not, right? To call something tolerant is to say something about how you choose to interact with people you disagree with or disapprove of, right? So one question is, am I rightly tolerating things that I disapprove of, right? There are some things I disapprove of that I shouldn't try to put a stop to. Am I making the right decision when I choose to hold back? But you could have multiple religions that are all tolerant in that way that still might disagree about lots of other things that are very important, right? And so you would still want to try to figure out which of those claims were true and which of those claims were false. Could you go to the microphone? Yeah, go ahead.
I guess I'll go.
You can go first, yeah.
Yeah. My question revolves around Locke's point about saying states should militarily intervene only if there are grave human rights abuses and multinational support. And my
Right.
question would be, at what point would you draw the line with saying multinational support? And I'll use like case study of like Israel right now and the infringement upon in a lot of nations' eyes upon the Palestinian people and the settlements that are in the West Bank and in Gaza. And it seems like there's a big push globally for intervention and stopping Israel's movements, but every time the UN comes to council, the United States vetoes it and the case is closed. And so I would just wonder, at what point would multinational support rule out an opinion or a intolerance that another nation holds?
Yeah, that's a great question. And to clarify, the example I gave isn't John Locke's own example, right? So those are contemporary examples I came up with to try to illustrate his principle. In specific answer to your question, I think what I would say is, I think it is too restrictive to demand the unanimity of all nations in the world, right? I mean, to set the standard that high would effectively to make it almost impossible to deal with injustice in a serious way. But I think I would want to say that it's important that there be support from a variety of different sort of country blocks, for lack of a better term. So in other words, the kinds of things that would make me nervous is if you have a coalition of people who support you, but all the people who support you are your close allies or people who are financially dependent on you, right? Because what we're wanting is kind of a diversity of perspective and diversity of opinions. I think Israel is one of the hardest cases to apply it to, frankly. Because normally one of the things I'd want to know is, what do the other countries in that region think, right? In other words, if we're trying to decide whether or not to engage in Somalia, it should count what the countries of Africa think about whether intervention there is a good idea, right? If there's support there, it's more likely to be a good idea. Israel is a much harder question because within the particular geographic territory, you have a sharp religious distinction that's the source of a lot of tension and conflict.
Okay, thank you.
Okay, so where do you set the limit of what Christian principles should be enforced legally and which should not?
Yeah, that's a good question. So I don't think there's any way I can give an exhaustive answer to that, because it would basically be talking about every possible law, we can imagine. But I can try to talk about what a few of the principles I would use are in thinking about that. One of when I have these discussions with students, the most popular answer is something like this, that if you're harming other people, then we need to intervene to stop you. But if you're not harming other people, then we shouldn't. And there's something right about that, but I think it's incomplete as an answer for the following reason. The problem is if we just try to use harm as our benchmark, most of the time we end up defining harm in what ultimately ends up becoming a circular way, right? So if I were to ask, what does it mean to harm someone? You might think, well, to inflict pain and distress on someone is to harm them. But then if we start thinking about that, if I say something that is, hurtful to your religious beliefs, for example, or I insult your favorite candidate in a particularly effective way in front of all your friends and humiliate you or something like that, right? You may feel deeply hurt, right? And it might even inflict an enormous amount of emotional pain, depending on the setting. But normally we don't count that as a harm because we're worried about what the First Amendment implications would be if we did, right? But objectively speaking, it's strange to say only physical harm is harm and emotional harm isn't harm. Of course it is, right? Of course we can be harmed emotionally in the same way we can be harmed physically. So what ends up happening in practice is we end up defining harm as those things we think it's okay to prohibit, right? But if that's all we're doing, now the argument ends up becoming circular. So that's part of the reason I'm attracted to Locke's principle, right? Because it gives us a few other vantage points. Now, that being said, I think there are many things where there's widespread agreement that it's a very substantial harm. So I do think instances where people are causing physical harm to other people are much more likely to be appropriate cases for intervention than instances that aren't causing physical harm to other people. But I think I would rather view that as a consideration that weighs significantly rather than pretending that it's kind of an absolute rule that settles the question. I also think it's important to recognize the principle of respect for moral agency, right? So in other words, the more central a question is to a person's identity, right, as they're trying to decide which path to take, and that's part of the reason why I think religious questions are so important, the more important it is to try to leave space for people to be able to sort those things out. Now, obviously, if your religion involves child sacrifice of unwilling victims, we're going to have to figure out ways of restraining your religious liberty in a case like that. I guess lastly, I would say, and this is just kind of, again, this is probably a theme actually from the last lecture as well as this one. Sometimes we have this goal of coming up with a kind of mathematical formula or series of crystal clear rules that we can just sort of mechanically apply. Like you could have this computer where you kind of input all of the data and it spits out the morally right thing to do. And I don't think that's how morality works. I think life is more complicated than that. And so I don't think we're ever going to come up with any approach to these questions that doesn't have to invoke wisdom as a virtue. Right? But part of wisdom as a virtue is precisely that you can't always specify ahead of time exactly what the wise thing is to do, right? You have to have all of the relevant particular facts in play and try to think them through and figure out what an appropriate example or course of action would be in a case like that.
So in your view, how do the definitions of mercy and toleration vary among worldviews? Are the definitions of mercy and toleration in Christianity unique to Christianity and different from other belief systems?
Yeah, that's a good question. So the first thing I can say is, in general, you can find support for things like mercy and toleration in religions other than Christianity, right? So I'm not trying to make the claim that Christianity and Christianity alone advocates for these things. I can give you more precision answering that question on the topic of mercy, because one of the chapters in our book, we actually looked at Islam, Buddhism, and Eastern Orthodox Christianity and tried to understand a little bit. And by the way, you could write, obviously, whole volumes just on those questions. We're trying to cover 3 world religions in a single chapter. So by definition, it's a very kind of first take type of treatment. But one of the things that we realize is that in all 3 of those religions, mercy is extolled as a virtue, right? Repeated over and over and over again in the Quran is praising Allah because Allah is most merciful, right? So If you look in Buddhism, for example, the emphasis on pity and compassion, right, are recurring themes. If I was going to explain where there's a difference, I think in Western Christianity, with regard to the subject of mercy, there's more emphasis placed on the relationship between mercy and distributive justice than you get in those other traditions, right? So in Western Christianity, and this has influenced our whole culture quite a bit, often we think of justice as giving people exactly what they deserve, and mercy as giving people better than what they deserve, right? And so that's one way of framing the difference between justice and mercy. And I would say in those other religions, that contrast is not nearly so stark.
Okay. So how are rights or wrongs established universally? For example, as you mentioned, many nations know and agree that racism, human trafficking, and global poverty are wrongs. However, there are many other rights that are still being globally debated. How is that debate for certain rights finished?
Yeah, that's a great question, right? So one of the things to say is I don't want to make the argument that all we do is look and see what everyone already believes and just do that and think our work is done, right? Because it's true, there are some things that we already have something of a global consensus on, that they're injustices, but there are other things that are still being hotly debated, you know? So you can look at, you know, the way certain kinds of pharmaceutical products are priced and sold in the developing world, right? Some people see that as a justice issue, other people don't. They think this is a matter of intellectual property, and respect for intellectual property rights means the companies that paid the money to develop the drugs should be able to sell them at the price they need to keep their businesses going, right? And so you have other questions that may raise real issues of justice where we don't have the same level of consensus yet. So I think what I'd say is, first, a big part of the approach I take to toleration is precisely that we need to be able to advocate for and try to persuade people to adopt positions they don't already adopt yet, right? So if I think that there's injustices in the way HIV drugs are being sold in Africa, but there isn't a consensus on that yet, one of the things I should be doing is trying to persuade people to see things differently, right, so we can try to build that consensus. The second thing I would say is how much consensus you need is partly a function of the type of intervention that you're describing, right? So in the talk, for simplicity, I kind of made it a simple dichotomy of either force or persuasion. But of course, there's a whole lot of degrees of types of intervention in between. And in general, right, the more you move toward things that look coercive, the higher the burden of proof is, right, before you justify action. But for some types of things, there may be other ways we can try to address the injustice that are less coercive but are still possible, right? So if we're looking at the problem of human trafficking, there may be ways that we can use non-governmental means, right, to try to help rescue people out of human trafficking, right? So coercion isn't the only option.
It is written, you have been justified through Jesus Christ, which gets around to our justice system, which says to me that the only true justice can come through somebody who is infallible like Jesus Christ. But yet we write laws, and we continue to have more and more laws in this world. And it is also written that you have been redeemed from the curse of the law. In other words, we have been saved by grace, not through works of the law. How can we get human beings to understand this so we don't have to continually force people to live in this world of legality and legalism?
Yeah, so in the lecture I gave last week on mercy, one of actually the biggest themes of the talk was to note that only God is infallible, right? Only God knows what's truly in a human heart. Only God knows what a person truly deserves, right? And so one of the things that the Christian tradition has said over the centuries, so this goes back to people like Augustine, Calvin, Luther, Aquinas, Anselm, the dominant position of those Christian theologians was to say, we should acknowledge that there's a type of judgment that only God is capable of performing, but that human governments have been commanded by God, nonetheless, to use coercive power to restrain wickedness and to promote the public good. Because ideally, right, maybe in a future heaven and earth where sin has been completely eliminated, there's no longer a need for coercion at all. But as long as we live in a world where there is wickedness, there's some need for governments to be able to use their power to restrain the wickedness of human behavior. And so the way I would frame it is human governments just need to have a lower goal, right? The goal of human governments isn't primarily to turn people into perfect people, right? Or to help them become adherents to the one true religion. But it is to use force to make our lives better on earth than it otherwise would have been by promoting the public good and trying to restrain some of the predatory ways human beings often act with respect to each other.
Okay. Are there times when it is appropriate for Christians to be intolerant?
Well, it depends on which definition you're using, right? So the way I defined it tonight, no. But the way I defined it tonight, no one should ever be intolerant because I built the word rightly into my definition, right? So the way I was defining toleration tonight, by definition, it's a virtue, right? So we're assuming that you've picked an appropriate instance where you shouldn't intervene and stop something even though you disapprove of it. Now, as I noted, that's not the only way you can define tolerance, right? Because you know, in the book, one of the things I say is it's intelligible English to say, I really think that was a mistake. I think that person is being too tolerant. Well, in saying that, you're assuming that there's ways you can make a mistake in being tolerant. And so, of course, I mean, one of the main points of the talk tonight is to say there are certain types of injustices in the world that we shouldn't tolerate, and we should be working to try to put a stop to those things.
Okay. So why do you think there was such a strong correlation between conservatism, Christianity, and not valuing tolerance?
That's probably a better question for a sociologist than a philosopher and political theorist. But you know, as an academic, you're kind of trained to speculate on small amounts of data, so I'm willing to speculate. So one of the issues is that in some of the movement that led to a lot of the philosophies that shape our politics today, you know, you go back to France in the days of the French Revolution and so forth, there was a strong anti-clericalism that was a major part of the opposition to other forms of government, right? So the people who are you know, cheering for liberty, equality, and fraternity in the French Revolution were often people who were also very hostile to the church. And part of it has to do, I think, with the history of persecution on the part of the church. In other words, I think if the church had listened to John Locke quicker, some of the reaction against the church that you see in the 18th century would not have happened, right? So that, I mean, if you want to give me the centuries-long take, the more recent take, I would say, is that for a variety of reasons, American political parties form coalitions, right? You know, one way of understanding Republicans and Democrats is it's not really one unified thing. Each party is really a coalition of different factions that have different priorities that figure out how to cooperate together to try to win an election. And partly it's just some of the quirks of how American politics worked out, that over time, people who were more conservative Christians felt more at home in one party than another, And the longer that goes on, there's a kind of self-sorting, right, as more people sort themselves out into one party or another. In fact, there's been a little bit of research on this that shows that if you went back to the 1970s, if you asked people whether they were religious, their answer to that question didn't give you any useful information in predicting whether they were a Republican or a Democrat, right? So in the United States, as early as the 1970s, that kind of polarization between politics and religion didn't exist. And I think it has something to do with just some of the political dynamics of the 70s and 80s, right, that set us on a course to get where we are now.
Okay. So with the presidential elections coming up, do you believe it is intolerant to vote for a social issue that could potentially be forced on a person that does not have the same beliefs?
Oh, unfortunately, the only way I can answer that is it depends on it depends on what the issue is. I don't think there's a way to answer that question in the abstract, right? So if there's if there's a religious group that wants to practice child sacrifice, yes, we may need to impose our views on them and say you're not allowed to do that. But on the other hand, I think there are many things where it's right to say that even though we disapprove, we need to allow individuals and communities some freedom to live differently. So part of the point of the talk is to say there is no way to give a simple universal answer to that question. We have to get more specific and try to work through the details of particular cases.
Okay. So then as Christians, how can we continue to combat the common narrative that we are intolerant as a whole?
Giving Veritas Forum lectures, I think, is probably the best way to do it. So what I would say is, I think one of the problems we have, and this isn't, Christians are not unique in having this problem, is that often the loudest and most abrasive voices are the ones that get the most media airtime, right? And that then shapes people's perceptions of what a given group is like. So the more people who speak up and voice different opinions, right, it helps to undercut some of those stereotypes, right? So I think that's a positive thing. And oddly enough, I'll also say, for all that we complain about the media, at the end of the day, we have ourselves to blame for it because they're only doing what we click on, right? You know, it's our remote controls and our mouses, right, that drive the media engine, right? What they show us is what they think we want to watch, right? And so if we make different choices about which media we consume, right, and we try to look to sources that don't caricature whether Christianity or any other belief and have more kind of reasoned, moderated debate, ultimately we start seeing more of those things in the popular media as well.
Okay, we have another question. How do we evaluate bombers who kill indiscriminately in terms of toleration?
I would say that they're acting unjustly and they should be stopped.
For more information about the Veritas Forum, including additional recordings and a calendar of upcoming events, please visit our website at veritas.org.